Starmer's not very inspiring, is he? But it'll be hard of him to try to shrug off pressure from the unions. Well, I guess that's also true. What happens when 5 years of Labour government fixes nothing, and then 5 years down the line again, we've got to then the Tories go even further right, and we just kind of continually descend down this neoliberal drain of falling living standards forever. And then the Conservatives win off the back of some kind of populist rush, or God forbid Reform UK win. If anything can be learned from the Tony Blair years, it's having a left-wing government that doesn't enact proper left-wing reform, at least on an economic scale, is going to make their own bed for later generations, right? Starmer is moving rightwards on social policy because the Overton window's been pushed to the right by the Blair government originally. And by having Starmer in power for those 5 years, is that just going to make it even worse further down the line? Will there be the ability for there to be some future right-wing shift and right-wing sentiment? Like, I really do think that there is incredible long-term danger in Keir Starmer being allowed to operate for 5 years as Prime Minister on such a right-wing platform, because we'll have even further disenfranchisement of working-class communities because he won't fix any of the real problems materially. And they'll continue moving further to the right like they did at the end of the Blair years and during the Cameron years. And then, God forbid, we'll have if the Tories do get demolished at this next general election, which is looking increasingly like they will be, because of Nigel Farage or the Reform Party, whatever it is, taking a huge chunk out of the Tory voter base and leaving it into a Canada 1993 position, could possibly mean that the real challenge to Keir Starmer in 2030 will be from an incredibly right-wing party, which will have the support of the populists in general. We as the left should be the people who are on board with the populists. We should be fighting on a left populist position, which is the exact opposite of what we're getting from Keir Starmer whilst he's swanning off to speak with billionaires at Davos, right? We lose a generation of working people to a Labour Party that clearly wants to spend its entire time pandering to a middle-class centrist homeowner types. Future Labour government will need to tackle the root material cause of inequality and racism. Keith won't, so a British form of authoritarianism, fascism could welcome after that. Yeah, 100%, Edward. That's my genuine belief, and that's why I think the unions need to put more internal pressure on Starmer to move his platform over. Because he will win the next election. I made a segment about this a few months back. My prediction was that Keir Starmer wouldn't win the next election, but I think I was wrong to say that. I obviously didn't predict that Reform UK would be increasing in the polling. This kind of internal strife from the Conservative Party, just this continual absolute barrage of internal chaos coming out of the Conservatives from all of the different corruption and sleaze and all the scandals that they get themselves through, and the press's desire it appears to destroy the Conservative Party themselves now that they realise that there's no proper left-wing alternative, to try and entrench the Labour Party into the values of centrism. What they want is there to be a controlled opposition, and now we've got a controlled opposition. By putting it into power, it sells the controlled opposition to the remainder of the public. The aggro-centrists have all gobbled it up and refuse to criticise it. That's why I probably shouldn't spend as much time as I do talking about electoral politics, and the actual real place for progress is going to be where, as Mark Welch points out in chat, it's going to come from the union movement. There is clearly a space ideologically to move into a working class, pro-union area, considering how high the support for the unions is amongst the general public at the moment. But the fact that Starmer won't explicitly do that and the reign of the front bench refusing to do that as well, apart from at a pinch, Angela Rayner. What even is the Labour Party? As Mick Lynch says, they need to identify with working people, and they're doing the exact opposite. They're identifying with business leaders and billionaires at Davos and landlord-type small business owners. That's not the people that the Labour Party should be appealing to. It's said, some legal experts have said that there's a possibility with the public order bill that they've been drafted by the Conservative Party, this will have an effect on the ability to be able to picket. If that is something that's being used to have an authoritarian crackdown, which the middle-class people in this country want, right? Middle-class people in this country would happily throw working people and or oppressed groups in this country under the bus, as long as it preserves their peace and quiet and their peace of mind. When we saw this in response to the 2011 riots, which were clearly born out of an antagonistic relationship between people of colour in London and police, the adversarial relationship between the two, deteriorating living standards, and a Labour Party that didn't speak for these people anymore. I was looking up on this stuff just recently, that's why it's on my mind. And in the year and a half between the election of the coalition election and the riots in Tottenham in 2011, 8 of the 13 youth centres in the Tottenham Borough in London were closed down. I'm like, well, of course there's going to be fucking riots. Well, of course, like, people don't riot for there being no reason, right? People don't protest for no reason. There has to be some kind of social ill at play that leads people to want to take radical action to understand this stuff. And there's a very famous quote from the London riots in 2011 where they said, well, we had to riot because if we didn't, you wouldn't be speaking to us. The response from the middle class in this country was they wanted further crackdowns rather than to alleviate the situation that causes the riots in the first place, because the entirety of the political and socioeconomic discussion in this country is completely removed from the material conditions that people live in. There's so much kind of liberal brain rot that pervades our socioeconomic understanding of this country. The only way that they could discuss the riots happening was in the realm of, well, they made a choice to go out and do the bad thing, so that's the only, all we need to do is put more cops and have more punishments, rather than address the underlying material relationship between the degradation of British society economically and the riots that ensued in the wake of the financial crisis and in the wake of austerity that followed. I don't think it's a difficult through line to be able to follow in those cases. Literally the same cycle every time: economic crash to right-wing surge to conflict to liberal cleanup and temporarily boom built on sand to economic crash. Well, yeah, exactly. In the neoliberal world, certainly. And that's why I think that even if we have a gigantic, like, stomping win from the Labour Party in 2005, unless they really, really and truly fix problems that this country has on an economic basis, which they won't because they refuse to because they're neoliberals, we'll just end up with we will end up with what's happening now in Northern Europe, right? The Northern European fascistic movement that we are seeing right now, actually not in Northern and Western Europe, right? We're seeing the rise of Chega, we're seeing the rise of Vox, we're seeing the rise of the Sweden Democrats, we're seeing the rise of whatever the fascistic party is in Austria that's doing really well in the polls at the moment, right? There's a very large amounts of right-wing sentiment in Western Europe, and it all comes from, the vast majority of it, as far as I'm concerned, comes from economic woes, especially considering what's happened post-pandemic, right? Obviously the pandemic, the laws and the lockdown rules that were put in place has given an extra element to this kind of right-wing upsurge there, where they are at the same time decrying authoritarianism on the government on behalf of measures that were made to mitigate the response, the effects of the pandemic as part of their response to COVID, is then being mixed up with their very authoritarian desire to control subcontinental and Middle Eastern migrants and African migrants moving to Europe in the wake of all of the things that are happening as a response to hundreds of years of Western European imperialism into those areas that has destabilized those regions over the last 50 years. So we are in the confluence of something that's really bad, and quite frankly, if the Conservatives weren't fucking up the economy as much as they were at the moment, right, we would probably be seeing that same thing happening right now. But the Conservative and Liberal parties of the European continent aren't quite as economically stupid as the Conservative Party are over here, and so haven't allowed them to be attacked on that particular avenue. So we are going to see the fascistic rise of the far right ourselves, but 5 years down the line rather than what's happening right now. Hopefully that means that it could be so far removed from the coronavirus pandemic, we might see it not be as resurgent, but there is a huge amount of link between the far right movement in Europe at the moment and like anti-vaccine stuff, anti-lockdown stuff. It's a really scary kind of confluence of right-wing activity over there. You know, it's bad when non-Marxists like Gary Stevenson are saying that economic conditions are so bad that we could get fascistic. I mean, I think I made this comment when we were watching his segment previously last week. I think Gary Stevenson is a secret Marxist who won't let anybody know, right? He keeps saying so many things that are kind of borderline Marxist critique that you can smuggle into the political discourse without outing yourself as a Marxist, that I think he might be hiding his power level, at least somewhat, at the very least anyway. I think that there's a lot of incredibly far-right language and ideology that's just kind of seeped into a lot of discourse without people even realising, right? Like, I quote tweeted this Dominic Samuels tweet, right? I don't know if people have seen the new Sam Smith video, which is, whatever, just yet another music video which is hypersexualised, whatever, sex sells, I'm not gonna... There's plenty more comment about that has been said by plenty of other people smarter than, more erudite than I am. But This is the original tweet where she says, Sam Smith is the perfect example of what degenerate Hollywood culture does to people. It makes celebrities vulgar, hypersexualized, and obsessed with wearing their sexuality like a costume and shoving it in everyone's face. I'm like, okay. The fact that degenerate has become such a poignant part of our public discourse in this country. Like, this person, like, if you want to call GB News as some kind of a mainstream news channel, I don't understand if you wouldn't want to, but I believe that it probably is right now. But she said obviously she's been on BBC, ITV, Sky News, Channel 4, Channel 5, etc. She's been on plenty of other mainstream news outlets in this country. Like, degeneration theory is literally a Nazi-era conspiracy theory about Western society being degraded from the inside, right? A lot of the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory comes out of degeneration theory and the fact that there is a group of people who are ruining Western moral values by including things such as the ability to freely express their sexuality, for example. And it's usually used as a shorthand to deride queerness, left-wing political ideology, and also Jewish people as well, right? It's really interesting how she talks about degenerate Hollywood culture. Like Hollywood, this place that's never at all been associated with Jewish people who were living in that side of the country because of anti-Semitism across the United States at the time, for example. This is JQ posting. I mean, I don't think, right? I'm not saying that she is a JQ poster herself. I don't think that she is specifically, deliberately an anti-Semite. I don't think when she says degenerate, she means Jewish intellectuals importing this stuff a la cultural Marxism, for example. But these people are stupid, and they will take in the dog whistles, which is what this is. This is a fascistic dog whistle, and they will promote it to the rest of their people, right? It's just the same with things like cultural Marxism and globalists, right? All of these are the things that people say where it can be, if someone is genuinely saying it in a fascistic manner because they mean it, it can always be used to be able to climb down and say, oh no, I actually mean this other meaning, rather than what it would otherwise mean in the subtext of this says. But the people who are saying it sincerely as JQ posting, because they can also have the same kind of it's always kind of clouded in satire, for example. There's always this level of plausible deniability in the real JQ posters that you never know who's doing it sincerely or not. Logano, JQ stands for the Jewish question. It's a reference to the Nazis. And it doesn't matter at that point who's doing it sincerely or not, because it's still spreading these ideas, right? I mean, the idea of societal degeneration goes back to Arthur de Gobineau, who was literally using it as an ability to be able to propagate ideas of scientific racism. You feel like people are in a position where they're ideologically malleable right now? Well, 100%. And genuine and sincere members of the far right will use people's fears around what happened during lockdown, what's happening with the vaccines, the genuine fears they have over corporate takeover of places like the UK, which is happening and has been happening for 44 years at this point in time. Right? But because they all fundamentally believe in capitalism as an ideology, they won't criticize it. They have to criticize bad actors within the system, and that can come in the form of the World Economic Forum or whatever. But it can also be used as a way in which to try and implicate Jewish people in a way that, far-right people would usually do. And that's what kind of draws a lot of left-wing anti-Semitism, or left-wing, quote-unquote, because it'll be leftists who should be using it to critique the structure of capitalism, won't properly apply a material analysis to it, and it will lead them to it being a liberal critique, which is then used to be able to further right-wing narratives, right? Like whenever you see leftists talk about the Rothschilds, for example, this is JQ posting. It's anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that they are engaging in because they've just not bothered to apply material analysis to something that should be materially analysed. Right? That's the big issue. And I'm pretty scared that a load of these things are being taken as read. A load of people will continually propagate ideas of degeneration theory, or they'll talk about globalism or cultural Marxism, because this discourse has been normalised, and the press in this country are idiots, and they haven't done enough research to understand what these people really mean, or what these people are accidentally meaning, by propagating this stuff without critically analysing what they're saying and the subtext, the context of where it's being said. If you feel like if we as progressives don't give people a direction to go in, then the right-wing ghouls will destroy everything, you are absolutely 100% correct, Ling Ling, 100%. And this is, again, it is another thing that is a failure of the British left within the Labour Party specifically, being wrapped up in Blairism, being wrapped up in neoliberalism, being wrapped up in the instruments of global capital that have led to this level of distrust in power that's come from the kind of alt-right type of people. Because by having a British left, quote unquote, that is allied with corporate ghouls in the way that Keir Starmer is and Jeremy Corbyn wasn't, there is even further room for people who would have genuine left-wing economic sympathies to get caught up in right-wing conspiracy theory nonsense, right? This is what happened. This is why we had the force of people like the EDL, for example. Because there was no left-wing, large left-wing movement speaking for them and their material interests, it was far easier for them to get caught up into scapegoating a minority to deal with the economic issues of the forgotten working-class communities in this country, because they had been abandoned by what should have been a left-wing government. And that is another reason why it's so dangerous that the press are turning Labour into controlled opposition again, because we'll see that cycle repeat itself, as JDM was pointing out in chat before. We'll see this cycle again, where Keir Starmer speaks for middle-class homeowners rather than working people. Working people see an entire political class that refuses to speak for their needs. A far-right group of people will then use that as an ability to be able to say, look, well, the actual issue isn't the fact that there aren't investment in communities. It isn't the fact that the union movement has been crippled so that you can't fight for your own material interests anymore. The real issue is immigrants. It's Muslims. It's these minority groups. It's these people who are destroying the fabric of society. Where we could turn back time and we could regress back to the glory days of the 50s and 60s or whatever. And because the breakdown in the social contract has led to the stuff we have now, they can be easily scared into the positions of the far right would agitate for in these circumstances. We're in a really dangerous position right now. You don't want to have a go at anybody, but you think you're a bit of a class reductionist by temperament. I know that things are more complex than that, but I don't like politics devolving into idpol. I mean, me too, MCH, 100%. But the reason why we have such a large focus on identity politics in this country at the moment is because class politics got destroyed by the Blair administration. Tony Blair truly, and I don't think that he was being insincere when he said this, he truly believed that the age of class politics was over, and that by following this third-way neoliberal ideology, he could bring together the collaboration between the bourgeois and working class in this country. And as we saw from the financial crisis in 2008, that was never going to work. That's the problem, right? Without there being a proper multifaceted left movement that fights for minority rights and the rights of individual groups of people in this, or demographics in this country that are oppressed by the overall superstructure of this country, whilst also incorporating class analysis into that at the forefront, because you've got to remember that class politics permeates through minority politics because of their position of oppression. They are more likely to be members of the working class as well. This is one great intersection, right? The vast majority of these people will fall into working class groups a lot of the time. Because the nominally quote-unquote left-wing movement that existed in the 2010s had gotten co-opted by centrists who refused to use their position to argue for class politics, this is why the idiots at Spiked Online or whatever will talk about people abandoning the white working class. Because they weren't abandoned because people spent too much time talking about identity politics. They got abandoned because people stopped talking about class politics. If there was still a high amount of class politics evident in the Labour Party today, and through the entirety of the 2000s under the Blair administration, these people would still be part of the wider left-wing movement. They weren't. The problem is the people from Spiked Online or wherever, the idiots from amusingly used to be part of the Revolutionary Communist Party, who had explicit support for the IRA. It's funny how Claire Fox will allow to be on Question Time without having any of her credentials about her links to support of the IRA being questioned. But shudder, should Jeremy Corbyn be a large political figure when he never even supported the IRA. He just supported the dialogue with Sinn Féin to be able to facilitate a peace process, which is not the same as what Claire Fox did. Is amusing to me, but that's an aside. But they will mention the white working class as if they're being abandoned because they are white, when that's not the case. They're being abandoned because they are working class. That is something that is shared between all of these groups. And identity politics will be weaponized by centrists to try and assume that they can fight for the rights of ethnic minorities and gender and racial minorities in this country without mentioning class. But you cannot do that. It has to be intersectional, it has to include class, and it has to be the forefront of people's analysis of what is happening in this country. Because if you don't include class, you allow a space for people like Reform UK, people like Spiked Online, people like these explicitly racist people, a lot of the time, let's be honest, to take that space and then use it to turn it into a racial issue when it isn't in the first place. It has always been a class issue. That's the problem. That's, again, all downwind of the centrist infiltration and entryism into the Labour Party in the 90s. There are many ways to divide the working class, and they're all cheaper than paying tax. True, Jim speaking, no word of a lie. It seems like a good way for centrists to try to deflect away from uncomfortable fundamental issues, though. Well, that's the problem, right? If any of the people in the centrist political and media bubble, because let's be fair, it's not just people from Spiked Online and from The Spectator who facilitate the discussion in this manner as well. Everyone from The Guardian to The Independent to all of these other media organisations that will refuse to talk about explicit class war politics because it's seen as scary Marxism, right? This is all again downwind from the McCarthyism of the 1950s onwards that happened in this country, because they're too scared to talk about class politics because it sounds too Marxist. They will then also do the same thing, but from the left or from the right or from the centre. It's a political groupthink amongst our political media class that you cannot speak about explicit working class politics in this country. You can't talk about this stuff because it sounds too quote unquote Marxist, as I mentioned before. And they will use that to defect against fundamental issues, right? You're absolutely right, MCH. And both sides will do this, but from different areas of the perceived culture war. And that's not saying that we shouldn't fight for the issues that are specific to minority issues in this country, whether it be about sex, gender, sexuality, race, whatever. We absolutely should. But we should also include class analysis in there as well. That's the important part. And these divides will only get further if we repeat the mistakes of the Blair administration. I have a really horrible feeling that this time period we're in with British history is going to be looked back on as the series of events that led up to a horrific period in human rights violations. I mean, I think that there will be people on the left who will think that. But the liberal media, they do not understand historical materialism, or they at least refuse to use historical materialism as a lens with which to analyse this stuff. So they will just assume that this right-wing populist sentiment just came out of nowhere, that there was nobody to blame for it, and that they were just bad actors in the system who just happened to turn up and make things bad. But we should really, fix that stuff right now, rather than looking at the base issues that led to this in the first place, because they can't ever criticise the system. It can only be bad actors within the system, and that will continue going round and round and round until the actual class issues at the heart of the discussion have been solved from base principles. They will again, it's oh dearism all over again, will be the defining moment of the 2030s, whatever it is. All of the politicians, all of the media class, all of the people who should be the people who should be responsible for holding power to account, but are too busy walking around in the same circles as these people who have a financial interest in maintaining the supremacy of this kind of neoliberal ideology, will refuse to critique it on a materialist grounds because they can't do it. So they'll just look at the issues of the rise of the far right in Europe and eventually in the UK, and they'll look at it and all they'll say is, oh dear.